位观众大家好，我是于文琪。我们今天非常荣幸请到了史丹佛大学网络政策中心资深顾问以及《The Wires of War》一书作者 Jacob Halberg 来跟我们探讨当今可能是最引人好奇的网络科技战。Jacob, welcome to TVBS.
Wenchi, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
That's great.I've known you for more than 10 years now, starting when I was at the State Department during a time when technology was touted as the solution to many of the world's problems, from locating and rescuing people in Haiti earthquakes to mobilizing democracy movement in the Middle East. Then you joined Google on their policy team and witnessed the creeping influence of authoritarianism on the internet,which prompted you to write a book, The Wires of War. So can you share with us what you've observed over the last decade of the role of the internet companies based on your personal experience in the technology sector?
Sure. So the biggest trend I've observed is really the technology industry, as well as the policymaking community, being reminded that technology is in fact neutral.You and I will remember in the early days of the 2010s, especially during the Arab Spring, when there was this sense of euphoria in the idea that the internet was inherently a liberalizing force that was going to help export democracy around the world and empower people. The school of thought that the internet was transferring power from institutions over to everyday people and empowering leaderless networks. And what we've seen is, in response to all those movements, autocracies started racing in order to figure out ways of actually using the internet to centralize political power and use it as a tool of political control and eventually oppression. And so fundamentally, just like every other technology, technology and the internet is neutral, and it can be used just like steel can be used to build a machine gun or a hospital. The internet can be used in order to empower people and free them, or to oppress people and control them. And obviously, when you and I first met, when you were working at the State Department, I vividly remember Secretary Clinton at the time saying just that, and observing how back in January of 2010, in her first internet freedom speech, she laid out this a vision for the right to connect. And ironically, 2 months later, the first seeds of this incredibly complicated dynamic unfolded when China shut down Google's operations in that country. Eventually, 2011, the Egyptian revolution breaks out, and fast forward a few years later, obviously 2016, 2017, we had Russia's interference in the US election, which kind of sparked this whole awakening in the tech industry, as well as in the policymaking community. And so this coming to awareness on the part of a lot of technologists and policymakers, I think, is a very healthy thing. And I certainly hope that a lot of policy efforts flow out of it. And that was part of the impetus for writing this book.
Yeah. And what about, it was fascinating to read your book in terms of your own findings and almost like awakening when you were at Google, right? Is there anything you can share with us? What shocked you the most, perhaps?
I think what shocked me the most was actually the cultural difference between a lot of folks in the policymaking community versus folks in the technology industry. There's a whole chapter in my book that's entitled The Hill and the Valley, that basically dissects the difference between these two incredibly important communities. There's a demographic difference. Obviously, people in the tech industry skew about 30 years younger than folks in the policymaking community. The average age in the Senate is early 60s, 61, 62. The average age of an employee at Google and Apple is 31, 32. Most of the people in the tech industry bring a lot of these questions with them, a background of product building, product management, and engineering, whereas a lot of people in the policy sphere approach these same questions with a background in legal training, and a lot of them are attorneys. So they think differently. They have very different life experiences, and they've come of age in drastically different eras. And so a lot of the times there's a very big disconnect. Folks in Washington take for granted the idea as being obvious, the ideas of, basic ideas of great power competition and geopolitics. But a lot of folks in the technology industry who have a lot of incredibly peerless insights in deeply technical questions are also sometimes a little bit less aware of geopolitical concepts and issues of great power competition, because it's not their day-to-day work. And so that disconnect really stood out to me as being a major problem, but also hopefully an opportunity, because it's a historically fraught relationship, but it's an important one nevertheless. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope to play a small part in it to help bridge those two communities in the years ahead.
Yeah, I still remember speaking to and working with some of the people in Silicon Valley, right? I think a lot of those technologists have this great ideas about changing the world. And that was kind of the narrative 10 years ago when we were working together. A lot of people truly believe that they can leverage the power of technology and internet to bring all the good things and values. And most of them are, truly Western values, let's put it that way. And so there's certain naivete there in terms of understanding the risk and how technologies can be, used or misused by authoritarian regimes and governments. So what I love your book is it paints a picture of the internet as sort of the geopolitical front of conflict and breaks down the physical country borders. So it helps our readers imagine national sovereignty, which is manifested not by traditional troops, by the ability of actually wielding technology, power, and dominance. And it is especially timely because you published the book in October, and you wrote a lot about Russia, Ukraine, China, and Taiwan. Then months later, the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, cyber warfare is used in the current ongoing war. So I'd like you to just kind of walk through what you wrote in the book and how that's so pertinent to the current war between Russia and Ukraine. And, if there's time, because it's such a broad topic, and maybe you can touch on sort of the China-Taiwan dynamics as well.
Absolutely, more than happy to. So there are actually three ways, in my view, three key points in the book, in my view, that in hindsight, were actually a little bit ahead of their time when I wrote the book, that are especially relevant in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. The first fact is that my book, and as hinted in the title of the book, is premised on this idea that the United States, democracies, chiefly the United States, and autocracies, chiefly China, are in what I call a gray war. Now, as I say in my book, you can call it a Cold War, a gray war, or a banana. The point is there is an existential political struggle for power going on between two superpowers, and followed by countries that have that are effectively de facto allies or sympathizers of those two superpowers. That is encapsulated in an incredibly crisp way in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where you have China on the one hand that is effectively aiding and abetting, where you have China on the one hand that is effectively aiding and abetting Russia, and you have the United States along with its European allies that is aiding very, very aggressively the Ukrainian resistance against Russia's invasion of that country. So that's number one. And the reason that acknowledging and coming to terms with the fact that we are in a gray or cold war is incredibly important, because I think that it's from that premise that you start to accept a lot of the actions needed in order to avoid that Cold War to become a hot war. Because obviously, if you accept that we're in a Cold War, you start to accept the need to prioritize doing a lot of things that you wouldn't otherwise view as making a lot of sense if you think that it's just a mere competition. The second point is the basic idea that the future of American deterrence means shifting from being the world's policeman to being the arsenal of democracy. So one of the points that I highlight in the book is much like an information network, alliance networks are more resilient when they're decentralized rather than when they're centralized in a single point of failure. So right now, we have had up until relatively recently American alliance networks that were essentially heavily reliant on American deterrence in order to preserve peace in different parts of the world and in different geographic theaters. Ultimately, if we want to avoid a situation where Russia and China call America's bluff, it is in the American interest to make sure that American allies are well equipped to resist an aggression, because ultimately, if Russia and China know that the only power in those regions that actually have deterrent capabilities are the United States, the only question that they'll have to ask themselves is the United States going to respond? Not, is Australia going to respond? Is Japan going to respond? Is South Korea going to respond? Is the United States going to respond? And we need to change that equation in order to ultimately change their thinking on costs versus benefits. So the war in Ukraine encapsulates this incredibly presently, because we actually see the United States, instead of responding directly, providing weapons to the Ukrainians to fight for themselves, which is effectively, before the US entered World War II, it's effectively what the US did with Britain to great effect. And famously, Winston Churchill referred to the US in those days as the arsenal of democracy, and that ended up proving to be an enormously successful strategy. The third and last point is that is highlighted both in the book as well as in the current ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, is the importance of supply chains. So the book has a whole part devoted to what I call the back end of the gray war, which specifically refers to hardware. And supply chains ultimately are absolutely central and vital to both driving the outcome of the gray or Cold War, as well as the back end front of that struggle. The reason is, if you control the internet at the hardware layer, you can compromise and control everything that runs on top of that network. And so ultimately, one of the things that we're seeing, two critical issues that stem from the control of supply chains, are the issue of integrity. Could China use its control of supply chains in order to undermine the integrity of our electronic systems, for example? But then perhaps—
And would that, sorry, just to be more specific so our audience understands, what do you mean, like semiconductor chips? What would be those hardware?
Sure. So for example, there was a case a few years ago, a scandal that ended up being unconfirmed, with the hypothetical that could a Chinese company embed a backdoor into a motherboard that is produced in China without American companies knowing. And realistically, American companies that buy electronic hardware from China don't have the bandwidth or resources to inspect every single motherboard that they import from China. So the issue of integrity is incredibly important, because you can have really great software, but if you have a bug at the hardware level, that software is not going to get you very far. So that's on the integrity side. Then there's the issue of access that is raised by supply chains. Can the United States rely on its ability to access those supply chains when it needs it the most in a reliable way? And we've seen so presciently in the current war in Ukraine how enormously independent Europe is on Russia's energy sector. Europe is struggling to wean itself off of Russia's energy because it is enormously reliant and dependent on the energy supply chain from Russia. For years, the United States has encouraged Europe to cut itself off from Russian energy. I think today it's time the US started drawing the lesson of Europe's experience and started taking its own advice in the context of China and weaned itself off of America's dependence on Chinese supply chains. The dangers of America's reliance on China for nearly everything else and the vital role that Taiwan plays in the semiconductor supply chain, I think is incredibly ripe for public debate, because if we want to draw the lessons from the current war in Ukraine and apply them 3 years out, 4 years out, whatever the timeline is, to a potential standoff in China and Taiwan, we absolutely have to be talking about what would happen to our supply chains in a conflict environment. And it's hard to look at the current disposition of our supply chains and feel a whole lot of reassurance, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this has awakened a lot of people in the policy community. That's why you see Biden's, current trip to Asia. He's announced a number of initiatives, and he made the effort to actually visit a semiconductor factory in South Korea because, again, having enough domestic investment back in the United States in chip production, when everyone realizes just how crucial it is, especially during the COVID pandemic. And so, it's hard to really capture everything in terms of what's going on between US and China and between Russia and Ukraine when it comes to technology and, whether it's competition or truly a war that is going on. And so what's interesting was, it's not just about, cyberspace being used to spread ideas and values, but also to extract data, right? That's what you were referring to in terms of, is there a bug, for example, in the motherboard? Should we be concerned about so much data that's flowing around, being collected and used for whatever purpose? And so this concern was, I would say, first brought up in the Trump administration, what we saw in Huawei and TikTok. And the Biden administration is somewhat continuing the policies. So how do you think about those policies, by which I mean like targeting specific companies because of, their ties to China, and which could be applied to almost every company now, I would say, because almost every tech company has some kind of operation or presence in China, and some even much more collaboration. So how do we think about those problems?
Sure. So if I could just put that question in context and back up a little bit, the default values of the internet when the internet was first invented reflected America's principles of free speech, freedom of assembly, privacy, and so on. And as a result, the early days of the internet de facto exported America's democratic values around the world. What we're seeing today is that China is trying to use its internet companies to export its own autocratic values, erode democracy around the world, and envelop countries behind its great firewall. Having personally seen how difficult it is for companies to straddle both sides of the firewall, my view is that it's unsustainable for companies to comply with systems that are increasingly fundamentally at odds, and that ultimately companies have to pick a side. So to answer your question, I think it's perfectly appropriate for the US government to take actions against Chinese technology companies, and I personally favor suspending TikTok in the United States.
That's a pretty drastic, I would say, move. Just given how everyone is using TikTok now. But we can talk about that later.
When to really answer your question about TikTok specifically, because as you know, my intellectual school of thought tends to divide the world of technology between software and hardware. Mm-hmm. And TikTok is a software application. So I would treat that question a little bit differently than Huawei and ZTE. I think there is a world where TikTok could be allowed in the United States, but fundamentally, in order for that, for TikTok to exist in the United States in a safe way, you have to basically address two concerns. There is the China's jurisdictional control over that company, which really boils down to where's the company based. That could potentially be addressed by a divestment process, which was under debate during the Trump years. Mm-hmm. But where a lot of scholars that have written about this issue often fall short is that the divestment question and the jurisdictional control question doesn't also address the technical control at an engineering level of that company. So long as TikTok has engineering staff in China that actually has access to servers of TikTok, those engineers are all personally legally required to comply with China's intelligence law, which effectively requires them to provide the Chinese government with information based upon China's intelligence requests. And it requires them to keep that compliance secret from the company's headquarters and its executives in the United States. So I think it's not enough if you want TikTok to exist in the United States in a safe way or in any democracy. It's not enough to talk about freeing the company from the CCP's jurisdictional control over that company. You also have to talk about how do you free it from the engineering control at an engineering and technical level. If you address those two things, I think could be reasonable for TikTok to continue operating in the United States, even though it's, I would argue it's is very conducive to people being extremely unproductive. But with that being said, we're a free country, so why not?
No, I think it boils down to the trust, right? The trust factor. Can you trust a Chinese company, literally, that the Chinese government or the CPP has the jurisdiction over, right? That's fundamentally, I think, what we're trying to get a grasp of. So, I mean, it's a bigger question. We don't have to answer it right now. I do want to move on to the next really important question about freedom of speech, right? So I think your book cautions the readers sort of the influence of authoritarianism and autocrats, over the internet. But I also think it's important to talk about freedom of speech. And this is especially interesting because that's kind of the divide that's currently that exists in our Silicon Valley right now. So you have a lot of libertarians who basically believe there shouldn't be any control on social media, right? Like Elon Musk type. And some, maybe your friends, famous investors. And then you have many who believe some restrictions are necessary because there's so much disinformation out there, and there's, penetration of all kinds of ideas. And perhaps, most people don't have a way of distinguishing what is the right or wrong, information. So it's a hard balance to strike in a free and democratic society in the US or, in Taiwan too. So how do you think about those problems? Should we regulate content or should we let them just run free?
So as I talk about in the book, and I think it's incredibly important for companies to approach this question with a very, very clear distinction between conduct and content. In the space of conduct, tech companies have had conduct-based policies to fight quote unquote spam ever since the internet was invented. And arguably, that's part of the reason why the internet was able to flourish, is because it has been able to prevent this, the worst of spammy behavior online, which has provided a smooth user experience and so forth. The space of content, I think it's important to remember that the internet basically flourished under Section 230, which provides platforms with platform immunity, meaning platforms do not have are not legally liable for the content that is hosted on that platform, based on the expectation that platforms are neutral. And so I think that, unfortunately, over the years, the two concepts have emerged in the last, the latter half of the 2010s. There's the concept of hate speech and the concept of misinformation. When they first emerged in the latter half of the 2010s, the definition of those concepts in platform content policies were very, very narrow. What counted as hate speech was a very narrow subset of things. And what counted as misinformation was also a very narrow subset of things. And what we've seen is the definition of those concepts have been getting broader and broader and broader, to the point where now you're starting to have a lot of discussion. And I think you're seeing a backlash effectively over what people feel has become an overly censorious environment. And so I think that my whole philosophy when I was working on these issues at Google, as well as after, is I think it's reasonable to have viewpoint content neutral policies that penalize bad behavior, which is a very narrow, targeted way to address, the worst of the internet. And it's also a very objective way to do it. But when it comes to content, I think that if a platform benefits from Section 230 immunity, it should uphold its neutrality, and it should effectively mirror jurisprudence on free speech. So I don't think it's healthy for companies to have these enormously expansive definitions for misinformation or hate speech that are not grounded in American law. And that are really the fabrication of tech employees, essentially, and as a result take far-reaching actions on that have enormous effects on free speech online. I'm not saying that there should be no policies. I think that ultimately the people that should decide what the boundaries are really the policymakers that have adjudicated free speech in our country for 200 plus years. Let's remember that under American law, it's not like free speech is completely uninhibited. I mean, you can't yell fire in a theater. You have time, place, and manner restrictions. We have American jurisprudence has defined concepts like fighting words to essentially define free speech, speech that is inappropriate versus speech that isn't. But it's also important to remember that unsavory speech is also specifically what needs protecting, because speech that everyone agrees with is not the kind of speech that's most often threatened. And so it's very important to create an environment where you allow room for what folks in the tech industry, back when I worked on these issues, called emerging theories. The theories that are seen as almost heretical, but that actually with time could potentially be proven to be true. Let's remember, the canonical example for this could be that everyone believed that the world was flat before it was proven to be round, and people thought that idea was absolutely crazy. And so that's just one extreme example to illustrate the basic idea that sometimes you have ideas that emerge that people think are fringe or or completely insane, but that actually turn out to be true. And creating a space where people are able to question, I think, is actually a healthy thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge topic, and it's also very, I would say, hotly debated in Taiwan as well, when, the government is trying to crack down on misinformation. A lot of it is coming from mainland China, through their propaganda machine. So just fascinating and very relevant. So today, we're also partnering with Tonghai University, and we have two students who are eager to ask our expert, Jacob, today. First off, Zheng Kai-en Joshua.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Hilbert. I'm a graduate student in political science at Tonghai University, Taiwan. And my name is Joshua, and my research interests are American politics, East Asian politics, and mythology. It is a great honor to have this opportunity to briefly discuss cyber politics with you. And today, the Russians implicitly started an information war on Ukraine. However, the West doesn't give an actual countermeasures against Russians' media manipulation. Therefore, Mr. Hilbert, are you aware of any signs of the West anti-disinformation measures against Russia? Furthermore, if there's another geopolitical conflict, will the West consider cyber warfare as their primary approach to confront the adversary?
And we'll have Tina, sorry, Jacob, just because of the interest of time, we'll have Tina ask the question too, and then you can answer both of them.
Great.
Tina, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Morning, Mr. Halborg. My name is Tina, and I'm a master's degree student studying political science at Tonghai University. And based on today's topic, I've been very curious that in modern society, as a cyber plays such a big role in either modern society and modern combat, there's a widespread concern over the strategic competition in cyberspace, including cyber espionage and cyber attack. So how would President Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy gear up for cybersecurity challenges? Thank you.
And sorry, Tina, do you mind repeating just the last part of that question? It broke up just a little bit on my end.
To repeat the last questions for the last one?
The last part of your question, how would President Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy?
Yes. So how would President Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy gear up for the cybersecurity challenges?
Got it.
I feel like this question should have been asked to someone else, unless Jacob is joining this administration. But I'll give you sort of the freedom to really elaborate on that.
So on the first question about whether or not the West is carrying out, as far as we know, any kind of cyber warfare activities against Russia in the context of Ukraine. With respect to, so there's a bit of a difference when we talk about cyber warfare. People use that term to refer interchangeably to information operations or hacking activities. Those two things are slightly different. By virtue of the private nature of hacking activities, right now there's obviously a fog of war going on, and we don't actually know who's hacking who, what information is being obtained. What we do know is the US intelligence community has, as far as has been publicly reported, been providing some assistance to the Ukrainian military, which includes intelligence assistance that hypothetically has been obtained through various sources of the American intelligence community, which could potentially include hacking. With respect to information operations, we haven't seen any evidence of the US using infoops, but it's important to remember that the American media does, Russian information operations often are designed to amplify narratives, a lot of the times that aren't true. So, they kind of have to create this very coordinated, elaborate network of online actors to amplify a given message that no other news agency is reporting, because the facts are often simply not true. I mean, if you remember during COVID, you had the Chinese, online ecosystem that was amplifying this idea that COVID came from a military base, and then it, pivoted to saying that it actually came from Italy. And likewise during 2016, the Russians were saying all kinds of crazy things about Secretary Clinton. Our media does a really great job at talking about a lot of things on a 24/7 basis. So including, live streaming Zelensky's speeches at the EU Parliament, or his address to a joint session of Congress. So that doesn't count as an information operation, but it really does count as a lot of airtime that is being given to the Ukrainian side of this equation. So it's not an info op, but it's what people in American politics would just call earned media, which has led a lot of observers to conclude that the Ukrainians are effectively winning the information war. The last piece that I would point out, where I think the hacking and the info ops piece of these equations actually join each other, is at the beginning of the war, a lot of military experts believed that Russia had such advanced cyber capabilities that it would be able to take down Ukrainian communication systems very quickly. And what we've seen is actually they have not been able to do that at all. Not only that, but Zelensky is beaming into capitals around the world to talk to foreign leaders. Now, part of that has been thanks to assistance that American companies like Starlink has provided. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have proven incredibly adept at being resilient from an information standpoint. So that's to answer the first question. The second question, as Wency pointed out, I would probably defer my answer to an official of the Biden administration. With that being said, I think one of the themes that really stands out in this administration is the emphasis that this administration is placing on coordination with allies. I think that is very, very clear based on President Biden's interactions with leaders of Indo-Pac countries, as well as the Indo-Pac strategy that the administration has formed.
Uh-oh. Are we losing Jacob? Well, unfortunately, I think the signal has an issue. So I think we're towards the end of our conversation now. But the last thing is, thank you, Jacob, for, it's such a fascinating discussion. This is a topic I would say is going to continue to dominate the whole conversation around geopolitics, the modern warfare. And this is Jacob's book, The Wires of War. It's not available in Taiwan now, but hopefully we'll be able to have the Chinese version. But today, thank you everyone for joining us. And we will continue those important conversations in the future. Thank you.